Okay, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are really glad you sent us this Satakubi material
Absolutely.
because today we're doing a deep dive based, well, entirely on the sources you provided.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating set of documents, isn't it? Getting into this fictional narrative about a clandestine cyberwar.
That's it. Set in like a near future Mexico, it details this pretty intense conflict waged against systemic corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission here, based on what you sent, is really to unpack the key players, what they did, the consequences, all as described in the sources, just to get a handle on the dynamics of this fictional world.
And the setting they paint is key, I think. Mexico sort of teetering on the brink. The narrative depicts it as, well, riddled with corruption, deep inequality, and also this rapidly expanding digital world.
Which turns out to be super vulnerable in the story.
Exactly. Highly vulnerable. And it's into that environment that the source material introduces our main subject, Llama Violeta, this hacktivist collective.
Right, Llama Violeta.
Yeah, the narrative positions them as this clandestine group stepping out from the digital shadows. They explicitly declare a kind of cyber war against what they see as, the corruption just eating away at the nation.
And it's not just some faceless group in the story, is it? The sources give us characters, individuals.
They do?
You've got Jimena, who's this disillusioned investigative journalist. Then Mateo, a brilliant cybersecurity guy, but totally frustrated. Sophia, a university student, apparently scarred by cartel violence in her past. And David, he's described as this enigmatic coder obsessed with OPSEC operational security.
And the source hints pretty early on that their personal motivations are, well, crucial. It's not just abstract ideals driving them. It suggested their individual histories, these personal wounds, are the real fuel.
Right, making it more than just politics.
Exactly. More personal.
Okay, so the group's formed. They have their target, this systemic corruption. How does the conflict actually kick off in the narrative? Do they just, go big right away?
No, the story describes a more cautious start. They begin with these targeted warnings, some minor digital disruptions. It feels like they're testing the waters.
Or maybe giving a final warning shot?
Yeah, possibly that too, before really escalating things.
But it didn't work, did it? The sources say President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration, in this fictional account, just brushed them off initially. Dismissed the threats.
Precisely. And that dismissal, according to the narrative, that seems to be the trigger, the escalation point.
Ah, okay.
Faced with being ignored, Llama Violeta then unleashes its first major move. They expose this ghost payroll scheme deep inside the Secretaría de Cultura.
Okay, so that gets their attention. That forces the government's hand.
Right.
What was it about that leak, according to the source, that made it impossible to ignore, unlike the earlier warnings?
Well, because a leak like that, it's not just a vague threat anymore.
Right.
It's concrete, specific.
Right.
It involves public money.
Right. Verifiable proof.
Exactly. Tangible evidence of wrongdoing. It just demands an official response. Inaction becomes, well, politically disastrous in the world they've built.
Which naturally leads to the government hitting back. Your sources detail the creation of this task force, Grupo Escudo Digital.
Yes, a high-level group. Its explicit mission, hunt down Llama Violeta.
And the dynamic within the task force itself sounds interesting.
It is. The source contrasts this very militaristic figure, General Ramos, with the more pragmatic cybersecurity director, Elena Herrera.
Okay.
And the narrative definitely hints at some internal friction there, suggesting the state's response isn't just one unified thing. There are conflicts brewing.
So Llama Violeta's got the government's full attention. They're facing this dedicated task force. And then the narrative describes a huge escalation, something called Operation Clean Sweep.
Right. This is where the story really shifts gears. It moves from those targeted exposures to a full-on assault against major state institutions. It signals a big strategic change for Llama Violeta.
And the targets were massive. Energía Nacional. That seems to stand in for giants like Pemex and CFE.
Correct. And also Programa Bienestar Universal, which sounds like a huge social welfare program in this fictional Mexico.
And the leaks from this operation.
Devastating. That's how the sources describe them. They apparently detail evidence of just massive corruption.
Like what specifically?
Billions siphoned off, widespread bribery, even direct links to organized crime. The narrative specifically mentions the CJNG cartel.
Wow.
And critically, the sources also highlight severe cybersecurity negligence within these state entities, basically saying their own lack of security made these huge breaches possible in the first place. It paints a picture of, well, systemic rot and vulnerability.
Okay, this is where the narrative seems to get really, really intense. What were the immediate consequences across the country from these massive leaks, as described in the source material?
It basically triggers a national crisis. Public trust in the government just tanks.
I can imagine.
Street protests erupt all over the place, and the sources mention significant damage to the Mexican economy as well. It's immediate, widespread, volatile fallout.
With that kind of chaos and exposure, the pressure on everyone involved must have just skyrocketed.
Oh, absolutely. Grupo Escudo Digital, the government task force, they ramped up their efforts massively, started using more sophisticated surveillance tech to try and find the hacktivists.
But here's something that really jumped out from the material you sent.
Yeah.
The government wasn't the only major threat they faced, right?
Exactly. The CJ&G cartel, having been directly implicated in the leaks, they start their own hunt for Llama Violeta, and the narrative portrays them as absolutely ruthless.
So they're caught between the state and organized crime.
Yes. This dual threat state security forces on one side, a powerful, violent cartel on the other. It really underscores the danger Llama Violeta is in. It's not just about dodging one enemy. It's two very different, very dangerous forces hunting them.
And the sources are clear, aren't they? That this immense pressure, this dual threat, plus the psychological strain of living underground, it takes a huge toll. It leads to cracks within Llama Violeta itself.
Yeah. The narrative describes internal fractures appearing. The pressure becomes too much.
And what happens to the members?
It's pretty grim. David the coder is captured. The source depicts it as a kind of sacrificial move, a misdirection to help the others escape. Then Sophia, the student, she seems broken by it all, terrified for her family. She ends up surrendering to an international human rights organization.
Wow. But Ximena and Mateo, the journalist, and the analyst, the narrative, says they actually managed to vanish.
They do. They disappear into the digital ether, as the source puts it.
But not before one last act.
Right. Before they go dark, the source describes one final, really powerful leak.
A devastating one, aimed at the Unidad de Inteligencia Financiera, the UIF, Mexico's financial intelligence unit.
Yes. And what this final leak supposedly exposed was corruption and political manipulation happening inside the very agency meant to be fighting financial crime.
Talk about a parting shot.
It's presented as this final damning indictment, showing how deep the problems run, right to the core of the system designed to police it.
So, okay, we followed this whole arc. Their emergence, the big operations, the pressure, the group fracturing, this final leak. What does your source material describe as the aftermath, the legacy of this Llama Violeta crisis?
Well, the narrative depicts Mexico as being left completely convulsed by political turmoil.
Resignations, scandals.
Yeah, the source mentions resignations, calls for impeachment, a real shaking of the political structure, and obviously public trust is severely damaged.
But does it fix the underlying problem?
Yeah.
The corruption.
That's the critical point the narrative makes. It notes the resilience of systemic corruption. So while some officials might face consequences, the deeper issues persist. It suggests there are limits to what even these dramatic actions can achieve on their own.
It's like a mixed legacy then.
Very mixed and complex. The source points to this paradox. On one hand, the digital world becomes much more heavily surveilled because the state is reacting to this kind of threat.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, the public, the citizenry, is depicted as being left more digitally aware, more demanding, maybe more skeptical, because they've seen what was exposed.
And the source uses that image, right? The violet flame.
Yeah, as this sort of lingering symbol of resistance, maybe burning less brightly, less overtly, but still there.
So it inspires others, but maybe differently.
It seems so. The narrative suggests it inspires new forms of digital activism, but crucially, these are described as being more cautious now.
Learning the lessons.
Exactly. It implies that the really high costs and the unresolved questions from Llama Violeta's actions serve as a kind of cautionary tale for anyone following.
So the story kind of hints that the fight for a more just Mexico continues, but maybe not through another big group like Llama Violeta.
Yeah.
More like smaller, localized efforts.
That seems to be the suggestion. Informed by Llama Violeta's controversial legacy, its successes and its failures, and the deep dive it took into the system's weaknesses.
It's a really powerful, complicated picture they paint of the ripple effects.
Definitely. High-stakes actions, high-stakes consequences.
Okay, so we've walked through this deep dive into the fictional narrative you shared with us. We've explored Llama Violeta's emergence, their Pretty dramatic actions, the intense pressures, how the group ultimately fractured, and the complex aftermath described in the source material.
Yeah, trying to unpack the dynamics and the insights presented just within this fictional conflict itself.
So thinking about this deep dive, what can you, our listener, take away from digging into these sources you provided? The story presents a really vivid picture, doesn't it? This intense dance between digital resistance, state power, organized crime, and the potential for societal change.
Or maybe the resistance to societal change.
Right, and it definitely leaves us with a pretty big question, one that kind of echoes throughout the source material, I think.
Which is,
Well, if, as this narrative depicts it, these huge systemic problems persist even after such dramatic, costly actions by a group like Llama Violeta, what does that really suggest?
what does it suggest about the fundamental challenges facing digital activism? Or maybe the ongoing fight for deeper, more lasting change itself?
Exactly. Something to definitely mull over.